May 1945, the war is over, but peace has yet to take shape. In the Ruhr, the heart of Germany's industrial empire, silence has replaced the roar of furnaces. The air smells of ash and iron. Half-standing chimneys lean over empty yards. In Essen, a steelworker walks through the shell of his factory, past twisted girders and the skeletal remains of machines that once forged tanks, guns, and shells. For years, this place powered conquest. Now, its future, and his own, hangs in uncertainty. When Allied troops advanced through the region in April, they found not only destruction but an economic engine too valuable to ignore. The Ruhr's coal, steel, and chemical industries had formed the core of the Nazi war machine, feeding armies and sustaining the Reich's ambitions. By war's end, nearly every town in this dense industrial belt, Duisburg, Dortmund, Bochum, Essen, was scarred by bombing. Yet even amid the wreckage, the Allies understood that these factories, if revived unchecked, could again fuel militarism. The challenge was immediate and immense: how to cleanse the Nazi taint from industry while ensuring that Germany could be managed, fed, and eventually rebuilt. The Ruhr fell within the British zone of occupation. Here, reconstruction began under the gaze of the British Army of the Rhine and the Control Commission for Germany. Soldiers turned administrators now faced tasks more bureaucratic than military, registering factory managers, cataloguing industrial assets, and drafting the first steps of denazification. "Destroy German militarism and Nazism," declared the Allied Control Council that summer, "and ensure that Germany shall never again threaten her neighbours." But even as policy took shape on paper, the ground reality was less clear. In the cities, workers stumbled back to find their workplaces looted or shattered. Coal mines flooded, machine shops lay stripped of wiring, and rail yards were clogged with wrecks. Those who survived the bombings now faced hunger and unemployment. Food rations were meagre, housing was scarce. Yet the Allies quickly realized they could not simply freeze the Ruhr. The region's output, coal especially, was essential not only to German survival, but to the recovery of Western Europe. Power stations in the Netherlands, factories in France, and the heating systems of the British occupation zone all depended on Ruhr coal. This tension, punishment versus production, defined the first months of occupation. The British military government's economic division began assessing how much could safely be restarted without reviving the old industrial powers. Some factories were allowed to reopen under military supervision, others were sealed, pending investigation. Warehouses were inventoried, machinery tagged, and company owners summoned to explain their wartime conduct. Many of them had served the Nazi regime loyally, some had employed forced labour. Others claimed they had simply obeyed orders to survive. The line between complicity and necessity blurred quickly. The denazification process that followed was as ambitious as it was chaotic. Every German adult in the zone was required to fill out a questionnaire, a Fragebogen, detailing membership in Nazi organizations, positions held, and personal affiliations. For industrialists, the stakes were especially high. The question was not just political guilt, but whether the skills that built the Reich could be trusted to rebuild Germany. Panels of Allied officers, interpreters, and newly recruited German administrators reviewed thousands of forms, sorting individuals into categories: major offenders, activists, followers, or exonerated. But even in these first months, pragmatism competed with principle. The Ruhr's industrial system was complex, interlinked, and technically demanding. Skilled managers and engineers were scarce. To purge them entirely risked shutting down what little production could resume. As one British official remarked, "We cannot coal the country with saints." For every factory purged, another faced paralysis. Thus, early denazification in the British zone leaned toward functionality. Remove the most visible ideologues. Keep the machines turning. Meanwhile, the Allied Control Council met in Potsdam in July and August 1945 to chart the long-term shape of occupied Germany. Their vision was uncompromising: disarmament, decentralization, and democratization, but beneath the declarations ran a thread of uncertainty. Could a nation stripped of its industrial core survive? How far could retribution go before it starved the peace it sought to secure? By late summer, British administrators in the Ruhr began experimenting with local committees to manage essential services. Engineers and miners, many still wearing patched uniforms or civilian clothes scavenged from depots, were called back to stabilize mines and power grids. In Essen and Dortmund, workshops reopened under strict quotas. Coal shipments to the Netherlands and Belgium resumed, small but symbolic. Each ton moved along rails under Allied control represented both punishment and recovery. Germany's industry would pay reparations in labour and material, but its collapse could not be total. For the ordinary worker, however, this policy balance offered little clarity. Factories stood idle for weeks, then reopened under new directives. Rumours spread that whole plants would be dismantled and shipped abroad. Former managers disappeared into detention or returned quietly, depending on which tribunal heard their case. Soldiers of the occupying army patrolled yards that once hosted Nazi rallies. The war had ended, but the reckoning had only begun. In this uneasy calm, one question hung over the Ruhr, like the smoke that once poured from its chimneys. Would the Allies rebuild these factories as tools of democracy, or dismantle them as relics of tyranny? The furnaces were cold, but the decisions to come would determine how and for whom they would burn again. Late 1945, in a cramped office above a shuttered steelworks in Bochum, a factory foreman bends over a sheet of paper stamped Fragebogen. The questions are blunt. Were you a member of the National Socialist Party? Did you hold a position of authority? Did you contribute financially to Nazi organizations? Each answer could decide his fate. On the floor below, the machines are silent. Production has stopped until the Allies decide who is fit to lead, who is guilty, and who may return to work. This is denazification as lived in the factories of the Ruhr, a bureaucratic purge that was meant to reshape a nation, yet quickly collided with the realities of survival. Throughout the British occupation zone, denazification was not merely political theatre. It was an attempt to rebuild society from the ground up. Every worker, clerk, and manager had to account for their role in the Nazi years. The Allies divided offenders into 5 categories: major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated persons. In theory, those at the top would face punishment, while the followers, the millions who had joined the Nazi party for work, status, or safety, would return to normal life once re-educated. But in the Ruhr, the line between ideology and necessity was never clear. The region's factories, from Krupp in Essen to Hirsch in Dortmund, had been the beating heart of the German war economy. Managers and engineers had designed the weapons, overseen the mines, and managed production schedules. Yet without them, the Ruhr's industrial system simply could not function. British occupation authorities, tasked with denazifying and administering this industrial labyrinth, soon found themselves caught in contradiction. The Control Commission's initial orders were strict. Nazi members were to be removed from all leadership posts. Local tribunals, called Spruchkammern, were established to process cases, relying heavily on German staff under British supervision. By the end of 1945, tens of thousands of Ruhr residents had filed their questionnaires, but the administrative backlog was overwhelming, and the post-war emergency left little room for idealism. Coal shortages crippled reconstruction. By winter, rail transport had broken down, and households across the zone faced freezing conditions. The British military government launched emergency programs like Operation Barleycorn, conscripting former German soldiers and civilians to harvest crops, mine coal, and repair power lines. In the Ruhr, these men worked under Allied direction, but in German factories, many of which had only just begun to reopen. The question lingered. Could an engineer who had served under the Nazis yesterday be trusted to supervise miners today? Some were removed and replaced by younger, untainted personnel. Others quietly stayed, their pasts obscured by bureaucracy or convenience. Archival records show that by early 1946, More than half of the industrial managers investigated in the British zone had been reclassified as mere followers, allowing them to resume work. The reality was pragmatic. Germany needed power, steel, and order more urgently than it needed purity. In the workshops, denazification took on a strange rhythm. British inspectors would arrive, audit staff lists, suspend known party members, then depart, leaving production to continue under temporary oversight. Factories became half-purged landscapes. One engineer dismissed, another retained, sometimes both working side by side until replacements could be found. Skilled labour was scarce, and the intricate machinery of coal mines, refineries, and foundries could not be operated by amateurs. For the workers, the process felt arbitrary. Some were dismissed for wearing a uniform. Others, known Nazi sympathizers, remained because they could fix a turbine or run an electrical grid. "We were all suspects," one Ruhr machinist later recalled. But the machines still needed hands. The moral reckoning that the Allies intended became a slow negotiation between guilt, utility, and exhaustion. Meanwhile, within the British Control Commission, debates deepened. Economic officers warned that a too rigid purge would cripple reconstruction. Civil affairs officers insisted that failing to remove Nazi influence would betray the war's purpose. Reports to London reflected this friction. In December 1945, a British memorandum admitted that denazification in the industrial sector cannot proceed without regard to economic necessity. In other words, the principle had to bend to production. The public mood shifted accordingly. Many Germans, weary and hungry, viewed the denazification process with cynicism. The tribunals, dependent on voluntary statements and neighbour testimonies, often turned into arenas of personal vendetta or survival bargaining. Some defendants insisted they had been coerced. Others downplayed their party roles, claiming ignorance of crimes committed in their name. A few truly believed the Reich's promises and now faced the humiliation of confession. By 1946, the process was losing its moral clarity. British administrators, frustrated by endless paperwork and inconsistent outcomes, began handing more responsibility to local German committees. The Spruchkammern multiplied, nearly 545 across the British zone, but their decisions varied wildly. In one district, a Nazi engineer might be banned for life. In another, reinstated after a month's suspension. The Ruhr's economy was beginning to stir again, powered by necessity more than ideology. Mines reopened, steel mills restarted limited production, and rail lines crept back to life. Yet beneath the clang of rebuilding lay the unease of an incomplete purge. The workers who powered the new Germany were often the same men who had built the old one. For the Allies, this contradiction was tolerable, for now. The immediate goal was to stabilize, to keep coal moving and prevent famine. But as the occupation settled into routine, new questions emerged. If denazification was compromised in practice, what did it truly mean in principle? Could a moral cleansing survive the demands of an industrial economy? By the end of 1946, the Ruhr stood at a crossroads. The Allied ideal of a purified, democratic industry was colliding with the pragmatic need to keep the furnaces lit. The questionnaires had been filled, the files stamped and stored, yet in the factories the same familiar names were slowly reappearing on office doors. The purges had paused, but production was returning, and as machinery hummed again beneath the grey winter sky, one uneasy truth took hold. In rebuilding Germany's industry, the Allies were also rebuilding the very class they had sought to dismantle. Ahead lay the next dilemma, whether to dismantle the factories themselves or let them deliver the materials of a new Europe. The furnaces were quiet again, this time by design. In 1946, Allied trucks rolled into Ruhr industrial yards, not to restart production, but to strip it away. Machines were crated, stamped with destination codes, and shipped abroad as reparations. In some factories, walls were dismantled brick by brick, cranes hoisted away under foreign flags. The operation had a new purpose, to ensure Germany would never again possess the means to wage total war. This was the beginning of the level of industry policy signed on March 29, 1946. It set a limit on German heavy industry, roughly half of its 1938 capacity, and defined which plants would be dismantled or destroyed. The Ruhr, as the nerve centre of German production, bore the heaviest share. From Essen's machine works to the coal yards of Gelsenkirchen, Allied control teams mapped, catalogued and tagged thousands of industrial assets. The official language was neutral: dismantlement for reparations and peace. But on the ground, it felt like economic dismemberment. Locals watched as equipment disappeared westward: rolling mills to France, turbines to Britain, precision tools to the Netherlands. In Duisburg, steel presses were cut into sections with torches. In Dortmund, workers dismantled the very furnaces they had rebuilt after bombing raids. For many, it was a second defeat, quieter but deeper than the first. The Ruhr had long been Germany's industrial heart, its veins running with coal. Yet, even crippled, it was indispensable. The British occupation authorities quickly learned that every dismantled machine risked slowing not just German recovery, but European recovery as well. The coal that fueled factories in Belgium or powered railways in the Netherlands still had to come from the Ruhr's mines. Every ton mattered, and every mine needed trained miners, pumps, electricity and spare parts, the very infrastructure that dismantling was destroying. By late 1946, reports from the British Economic Division were already uneasy. The Ruhr's productivity was collapsing faster than anticipated. Output fell to barely 30% of pre-war levels. Thousands of workers were unemployed, food rations were shrinking, and the winter of 1946 to 47 brought Europe to the brink of a humanitarian crisis. The Allied dream of disarmament through deindustrialization was colliding with the hard limits of survival. At the same time, the political landscape was shifting. The Soviet Union, occupying the Eastern Zone, had begun its own program of industrial removal, an extraction so sweeping that entire plants disappeared eastward. To the west, British and American policymakers watched with growing alarm. A weak Germany, they realized, might invite not peace, but instability. The debate hardened along two lines. The French, haunted by memories of invasion, demanded that the Ruhr remain permanently restricted, a neutralized industrial basin under Allied control. The Americans, increasingly focused on rebuilding Europe as a barrier to Soviet expansion, began to argue for a different approach: reconstruction rather than ruin. Inside the Ruhr itself, the contrast was visible. In Essen, small repair shops began reopening to service mine machinery. In Bochum and Hagen, engineers quietly refurbished tools that had escaped Allied inventory. Black markets flourished in spare parts, coal, and scrap metal. The British military government oscillated between tightening control and turning a blind eye. Their administrators were stretched thin, governing millions of people, dozens of major industries, and a landscape still full of rubble. Meanwhile, in makeshift housing across the region, displaced persons, former forced labourers, refugees from the east, and demobilised soldiers joined the swelling labour pool. Many were put to work in reconstruction programmes, clearing wreckage, repairing rail lines, or assisting dismantling crews. For them, the Ruhr was neither a symbol nor a policy, but the only place with work. Operation Coal Scuttle, launched by the British in late 1946, mobilised thousands to keep coal production alive through the bitter winter. For ordinary Ruhr families, survival became a daily negotiation. A factory stripped of its machines could no longer pay wages. A mine shut for reorganisation meant entire neighbourhoods freezing in unheated homes. In some towns, hunger drove protests. British officers recorded reports of workers refusing to assist dismantling teams or sabotaging shipments by losing vital parts. To dismantle Germany, it turned out, required German hands, and those hands were increasingly unwilling. By 1947, the Allied powers themselves were divided over what to do next. France still pressed for international control of the Ruhr. Britain, exhausted by the cost of occupation, wanted economic stability. In Washington, policy had already shifted toward recovery. The Marshall Plan, announced in June 1947, was based on a new logic. Europe could not rebuild unless Germany did too. The Ruhr became the pivot of that transformation. Allied restrictions began to soften, not officially at first, but through exceptions, waivers, and quiet approvals. Mines were allowed to expand output. Small factories received limited licenses to resume work. The flow of dismantled equipment slowed. Behind the scenes, British and American planners were already drafting revisions to the level of industry plan. In public, the rhetoric of denazification and punishment continued. In practice, a new strategy was taking shape, one of rehabilitation. Economic officers spoke of controlled recovery, of restoring productive balance. The Ruhr, once condemned as the arsenal of tyranny, was being reimagined as the engine of reconstruction. But not everyone welcomed the shift. For many in the region, dismantling had left scars not only on the landscape but on memory. To watch cranes tear down the furnaces their fathers had built was to relive the war's defeat without its clarity. In beer halls and union offices, bitterness brewed. Why should ordinary workers pay again for the crimes of their leaders? In the spring of 1948, as the last pieces of machinery left for France, a different kind of cargo began moving the other way. Shipments of grain, machinery parts, and aid supplies. The Allies were no longer just occupiers. They were partners in reconstruction. Still, the question lingered. The Ruhr's mines and factories could once again feed Europe, but whose Europe would they serve? As the furnaces cooled for what many thought would be the last time, the winds of a new political struggle were rising. The Cold War was at the gates, and the Ruhr's destiny was about to be redrawn, not as a conquered prize, but as the contested heart of a new world order. Summer 1948. In a villa outside London, maps of the Ruhr were spread across a table, dotted with red pins marking coal fields, smelters, and transport lines. Across the channel, the machinery of occupation was changing shape. The dismantling of factories was nearly over, and a new question dominated Allied strategy: how to manage the Ruhr, not as a defeated territory, but as the industrial heart of a recovering Europe. That same summer, a new body was born, the International Authority for the Ruhr. It was a treaty-based institution, charged with supervising coal and steel production, allocating exports, and ensuring that no single power, not even the newly emerging West Germany, could use the Ruhr's output for rearmament. Representatives from Britain, France, the Benelux countries, and the United States took seats at its table. For the first time, the furnaces of the Ruhr would answer to an international council. To many Germans, it felt like an occupation by another name. The Ruhr's coal miners and steel workers saw foreign inspectors visiting their plants, counting production quotas, and setting export levels. In Essen, Krupp's executives, many of them recently reinstated, complained that Germany was being asked to work but not to own. Yet to the Allies, this system was a safeguard, a mechanism to keep the industrial core of Europe under shared control, while Germany was still finding its political feet. The international authority's creation reflected a deeper shift in Allied thinking. 2 years earlier, punishment had guided policy. Now, with the Cold War tightening, the new priority was stability. The Western zones were merging into a single economic unit, soon to become the Federal Republic of Germany. In that climate, the Ruhr was no longer merely a threat, it was a necessity. Inside the British Occupation Administration, optimism mingled with unease. The Control Commission for Germany began handing more responsibility to German civil agencies, preparing for self-government. The Petersburg Agreement of November 1949 allowed West Germany to join international organizations and marked the beginning of Allied withdrawal from day-to-day control. But the Ruhr, strategically vital and politically sensitive, remained under the authorities' watch. For workers on the ground, the changes were felt in subtler ways. In Duisburg, trains once again ran on schedule, hauling coal to Rotterdam and Antwerp under international quotas. Wages rose modestly, and rationing began to ease. Yet the memory of dismantling and occupation lingered. In trade union meetings, miners spoke of freedom under supervision. Every shipment of coal had to be approved, every expansion of capacity reviewed. Even the repair of a blast furnace could require a foreign signature. Still, production was climbing. By 1950, the Ruhr's steel output had doubled compared to 1947. Coal production neared pre-war levels. The Deutsche Mark, introduced in 1948, had stabilized prices and revived trade. Across Western Europe, reconstruction accelerated. French railways, Dutch factories, and British power stations were all running on Ruhr coal. The region that had once symbolized destruction was again indispensable, but denazification, officially still in place, was losing momentum. The Spruchkammern were being dissolved, and thousands of unresolved cases were quietly closed. Many who had been banned from their professions returned under new contracts. The need for experienced administrators and engineers outweighed the desire for a moral reckoning. By 1951, the Bundestag passed Law 131, effectively restoring pensions, positions, and rights to many former officials and industrial managers who had been purged after the war. In the Ruhr's boardrooms, old names resurfaced. Executives who had overseen wartime production now chaired reconstruction committees. The British authorities, facing their own economic crises at home, accepted this as a practical compromise. "We are not here to perpetuate guilt," one Control Commission report noted, "but to secure the future of Western Europe." Meanwhile, the machinery of oversight was evolving. The International Authority for the Ruhr, though intrusive, was also a prototype, a first experiment in transnational economic governance. Its framework would later inspire the European coal and steel community, the embryo of the European Union. What had begun as a mechanism of control was quietly turning into a model of cooperation. In Essen, the furnaces of Krupp began to burn again, cautiously, under watchful eyes. The company had been barred from arms production, but was allowed to resume civilian manufacturing. Rail wheels, pipes, and tools. The transition was symbolic. The very factory that once produced the weapons of conquest was now rebuilding railways across Europe. By 1951, the last dismantling teams left the Ruhr. Less than 5% of its industrial base had ultimately been removed, far less than the Allies had once planned. What had been envisioned as a post-war punishment had evolved into the foundation of Europe's economic revival. And yet the past lingered in the smoke above the chimneys. Many workers still remembered the interrogations, the empty warehouses, the hunger years. Allied administrators, too, carried their doubts. Had they truly purged the spirit of militarism, or merely repainted its machinery in peacetime colours? In the pubs of Dortmund and the town halls of Essen, conversations began to shift from survival to dignity. Who controls the Ruhr became not only an economic question but a political one. Could a democratic Germany exist if its industrial heart still answered to foreign powers? The Ruhr was producing again, but not yet free. It's coal-fed, a continent rebuilding under the shadow of new alliances, new fears, and a new order. The question that had haunted the Allies since 1945 returned in a different form: how to ensure that prosperity would serve peace, not power. And as the dawn of the 1950s broke over smokestacks glowing red once more, the next stage of the Ruhr's transformation began, not in boardrooms or treaties, but in the lives of the workers and families who had carried its weight through ruin and renewal. In the grey light of a Ruhr morning, a miner adjusts the flame of his lamp before descending into the shaft. The air smells of coal dust and damp stone. It is 1947, or 1948, or 1950, the years blur together in the rhythm of work. Above ground, the world keeps changing. Allied trucks have given way to German ones, rubble is slowly replaced by scaffolds, and new signs hang where old party symbols once stood. But beneath it all, the same hands still turn the same machines. This is the human face of denazification, where policy met exhaustion. In the offices and furnaces of the Ruhr, the rebuilding of Germany was not only political or economic, it was moral, and moral work is slow. The British administrators overseeing the region had long since learned that reconstruction required more than decrees. Mines needed workers, trains needed coal, communities needed hope. The Ruhr was not a symbol to them, it was a logistical nightmare, millions of people displaced, underfed and crowded into cities that still stank of bomb ash. Yet, amid that wreckage, something remarkable happened. The industrial machine began to move again, powered by hands that had once served the Reich, by refugees from the East, by women stepping into workshops, and by men too young or too scarred to have fought at all. Labour was the glue holding the region together. The British launched a series of operations to revive production. Operation Barleycorn to bring in workers for harvest and coal mining. Operation Coal Scuttle to push coal output through the winter of 1946 to 47. Displaced persons, Poles, Ukrainians, Italians, Dutch, joined German miners underground, many of them former forced labourers who had nowhere else to go. Their presence was uneasy, the line between liberator and survivor was thin. In towns like Herne and Gelsenkirchen, temporary camps grew around mine entrances. Barracks built for soldiers now housed families. Children scavenged slag heaps for scraps of metal to sell. The Allied command provided food, but never enough. Coal for bread became a grim slogan of the time, the Ruhr's exports feeding Europe while its workers went hungry. Inside factories, denazification had slowed to a crawl, the tribunals were overwhelmed, the paperwork endless. By late 1947, most employees in the industrial sector had been classified as Mitläufer, followers. They were not innocent, but neither were they barred from work. In practical terms, this meant the Ruhr's moral reconstruction would be left to conscience, not committees. Still, the question of guilt did not vanish. Many towns held public meetings to discuss collaboration, often erupting into bitterness. Some called for a clean break, new management, new unions, new ethics. Others argued that survival had left no room for ideology. If every man who joined the party is a criminal, one miner asked, who is left to mine the coal? In the workshops, former Nazi engineers trained the next generation. Some tried to distance themselves from the past, others simply ignored it. The Allied officials knew this, but by now their priorities had shifted from punishment to productivity. A British report from 1948 admitted, "The majority of skilled men are technically indispensable." Another officer wrote bluntly, "We cannot rebuild a nation by dismissing it." Yet in the homes and churches of the Ruhr, the reckoning continued. Widows of the war dead tended graves beside displaced families from Silesia and East Prussia. Priests preached forgiveness. Union leaders called for justice. Many workers, stripped of wartime status and property, found solace in solidarity. The miners' unions, once controlled by Nazi fronts, re-emerged as powerful forces advocating for fair wages and democratic representation. For the first time in years, ordinary labourers felt their voices mattered. Communities rebuilt from the ground up. In Essen, women's cooperatives opened soup kitchens. In Bochum, teachers reopened night schools to retrain workers. Across the Ruhr, the line between victim and participant blurred into the shared struggle of endurance. The economy's revival was visible. Railways reopened, furnaces glowed again, but the moral reconstruction ran deeper, in the slow act of people learning to trust one another after a decade of indoctrination and betrayal. The Allied occupation government watched this transformation with wary satisfaction. Coal quotas were met, exports flowed again. On paper, the Ruhr was stabilising. But in private correspondence, British officers noted a recurring anxiety. "We have rebuilt industry faster than conscience." The observation was prescient. The rush to restore output had left questions of accountability unresolved. And yet the social recovery of the Ruhr was real. The return to work, however imperfect, brought dignity. Young men and women who had known only war found purpose in rebuilding roads, factories, and homes. Wages were meagre, but they were wages earned freely. The hum of machinery became the region's heartbeat again, signaling not victory, but survival. By the early 1950s, Ruhr towns began to resemble themselves once more. New houses rose on old foundations. Coal trains rumbled through stations where Allied tanks had once stood guard. The foremen who once filled out Fragebogen questionnaires now signed export forms instead. Denazification had ended not with absolution, but with fatigue. Still, beneath the clatter of renewed life, a question persisted, one that no tribunal could answer. If so many of the same hands and names remained, what had truly changed? As the Ruhr's workers poured out of their shifts into the cold evening air, the furnaces glowed on the horizon, symbols of labour, resilience, and uneasy redemption. The region was alive again. But its conscience, like its soil, had been mined deep, and the seams of memory were far from exhausted. And soon those same factories, stripped, regulated, and reborn, would become the engines of something larger, the economic revival of a new West Germany, and with it the question of whether growth could finally erase the shadows of guilt. A cold dawn settles over Duisburg in early 1952. A train creaks to life, its cars heavy with steel bound for the Netherlands. The same rails that once carried munitions now deliver the material of recovery. For the first time since the war, the Ruhr feels alive, not triumphant, not proud, but working again. The dismantling is over. The cranes that once tore down blast furnaces now build them anew. Allied teams have packed up and left. In the Ruhr's endless web of mines, mills, and machine shops, the rhythm of production hums back to life. But what began as reconstruction is quickly turning into something larger, a rebirth. In Bonn, the new West German government under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer calls it a Wirtschaftswunder, an economic miracle. Across the country, factories reopen, wages rise, and consumer goods return to shop windows. In the Ruhr, the miracle feels less like magic and more like momentum, an unstoppable accumulation of labour, necessity, and compromise. The same coal that once fueled panzer divisions now feeds the furnaces of Western Europe. The transformation is not just national, but continental. In 1951, the European Coal and Steel Community is founded, uniting the industries of France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and West Germany under a single framework. The Ruhr's output, once a weapon of war, is now bound by treaties of cooperation. Under this new order, German steel is no longer a threat. It is a pillar of European peace. Yet the miracle carries its contradictions. Many of the industrial families and firms that had dominated before 1945, Krupp, Thyssen, Hirsch, quietly regain influence. Their directors, purged a few years earlier, return as technical advisors or consultants. Within a few years, they are again at the helm. It is as though the Ruhr's machinery has been repaired but not entirely redesigned. In Essen, the Krupp works reopen under a new charter focusing on civilian goods, rail equipment, machinery, ship parts. Ivan Hurst, the British officer who had revived Volkswagen in the British zone, becomes an emblem of the new pragmatism: rebuild, rehire, and regulate. The Allies' goal of a pacified, productive Germany is finally realised, though perhaps not as they once imagined. Coal production surges to record levels, steel plants operate around the clock, Ruhr towns expand, drawing in workers from across West Germany and from abroad. Trains full of Italian and Greek guest workers arrive to fill labour shortages in mines and factories. Cafes reopen, cinemas glow again, and children grow up with the hum of industry as their lullaby. But prosperity brings amnesia. The ruins of the old war industries are cleared, their histories buried under new concrete. In Essen, a museum exhibit on reconstruction and progress displays modern tools beside faded photographs of the same factories under swastikas. Few visitors linger at those images. In the rush toward prosperity, memory becomes a burden. Still, some traces cannot be erased. The pollution from the Ruhr's reborn factories stains the sky once more. Rivers run black with runoff. The same smokestacks that now symbolize progress had once signaled destruction. Older workers remember, not with pride, but with the unease of those who have lived through the cycle before. For the Allies, this resurgence is both a victory and a surrender. The Ruhr has become what they always feared and finally needed, the industrial core of a strong capitalist Germany. What was once controlled by occupation is now integrated by partnership. In 1955, when West Germany joined NATO, the logic of post-war restraint gave way entirely to that of alliance. Inside the region, the sense of change is palpable. Miners earn steady wages, streets are paved, families buy radios, bicycles, and then cars. The hardships of the occupation years fade into memory, replaced by cautious confidence. For the first time in decades, the word future no longer sounds dangerous. Yet, in quiet moments, the question of continuity lingers. The moral debt of the past remains unpaid, not in tribunals or treaties, but in silence. Many who had built the weapons of the Reich now build the infrastructure of democracy. The line between complicity and contribution blurs until it is almost invisible. By the mid-1950s, the Ruhr's economy hums in perfect synchrony with Western Europe's reconstruction. Its coal powers Paris, its steel rebuilds Rotterdam, its rails connect the continent. The region that once armed conquest now underwrites peace. But in the hum of turbines and the glow of blast furnaces, one might still hear the echo of older ambitions, the same belief in production as destiny. The Allies had sought to control the Ruhr through dismantlement, then through supervision. Instead, they had unleashed its recovery. The factories they once feared became the engine of the West's prosperity, and the question of denazification faded into history's footnotes. The Ruhr's rebirth was complete, but it was also conditional, a prosperity built on forgetting as much as rebuilding. For its people, that forgetting was a relief. For historians, it would remain a riddle, and in the years to come, as Europe integrated and the Cold War deepened, the Ruhr's furnaces would burn brighter than ever, until, decades later, they would begin to dim again, and the memory of what they once forged and what they tried to forget would return to the surface. By the mid-1950s, the Ruhr's skyline had changed once more. The old blast furnaces still stood, but around them rose office blocks, new rail depots, and housing estates built from post-war concrete. The region that had once been synonymous with war production now called itself the engine of Europe. Yet beneath the steel and the slogans lay questions that no treaty could settle. What, after all, had denazification truly achieved, and what had been quietly left behind? In Essen, a former armaments plant became a museum of industry. Families walked through its cavernous halls on Sundays, marvelling at turbines and locomotives, their children unaware that these same machines had once supplied the Wehrmacht. The past was being curated now, not erased, but tamed. The rusted cranes and furnaces became monuments to labour rather than guilt. Across the Ruhr, industrial relics turned into symbols of endurance, their stories rewritten in the language of progress. Law 131, passed in 1951, had officially closed the book on denazification. Tens of thousands of former officials and managers were reinstated or compensated. The Allied Control Commission had withdrawn, and the Spruchkammern were gone. West Germany's courts declared the remaining cases obsolete. The moral architecture of post-war justice, once so ambitious, had quietly dissolved into administrative amnesty. The reasoning was pragmatic. The new republic needed stability more than penance. But for many Germans, and for the Ruhr especially, this closure left a silence where accountability should have been. And yet, life pressed on. The economic miracle surged. Coal and steel production broke records, cities rebuilt faster than memory could follow, and the new Federal Republic became a trusted partner in Western alliances. To the miners of Gelsenkirchen and the machinists of Bochum, denazification had become a distant word, buried under the clang of prosperity. What mattered now was the next shift, the next paycheck, the the next train of exports bound for France or Britain. But time has its own patience. In the decades that followed, as West Germany confronted its wartime past more openly, the Ruhr's story resurfaced, not as accusation, but as reflection. Scholars and journalists traced the lines of continuity that had carried wartime elites into peacetime management. Museum exhibits began to show the dual life of industry, creation and destruction, work and war. The old factories became sites of memory. In Duisburg and Oberhausen, decommissioned furnaces turned into cultural landmarks. Where molten iron had once poured, schoolchildren now walked through light installations about democracy, labour and remembrance. The region itself changed with the times. By the 1960s, coal seams were thinning, and cheaper imports began to outcompete the Ruhr's mines. By the 1980s, smokestacks fell silent again, this time not from war, but from decline. Steel towns faced unemployment, and the engine of Europe turned towards services, universities, and technology. The transformation from forge to future was complete. Yet the memory of its origins remained embedded in the soil. Beneath parks and motorways lie the tunnels of old mines. Beneath prosperity lay the echo of a harder question: whether a nation can truly cleanse itself through rebuilding. For every monument to progress, there were invisible absences, names forgotten, debts unpaid, lives folded into the machinery of reconstruction. The Ruhr's post-war journey became a lesson in paradox. Denazification had begun as a moral reckoning and ended as management. Industrial dismantling had aimed to weaken Germany, but instead strengthened Europe. The very region once feared as the arsenal of the Reich became the foundation of European unity. Out of control came cooperation, out of punishment, prosperity. Today, when visitors stand at the viewing platforms of the old steelworks at Landschaftspark Duisburg Nord, they see more than ruins. They see the outlines of an idea that a society can rebuild not by forgetting, but by learning how to live with what cannot be undone. The air is cleaner now, the silence gentler, but the structures remain, vast, rusted and honest. The Ruhr's factories began as instruments of power, were remade as tools of justice, and endure now as witnesses. Their story is Europe's story, of destruction turned to reconstruction, of memory struggling with modernity, of futures built on the uneasy foundations of the past. And as dusk settles over the valley once more, the old chimneys stand against the fading light. No longer spewing smoke, but shadow. A quiet reminder that even when the furnaces cool, history keeps its heat. Cap.